13 games up, so let's dive right into it. And we're going to start with Missouri taking on Georgia. Georgia, 38.5-point favorite. This is rising close to 40. We got news from the Missouri quarterback situation, which we'll get to in a second, but the total is 60 points. Obviously, most of that coming through Georgia, but can you target this for DFS? Missouri's pass heavy. They're fast, but it's not really looking like we're going to see much of that here. Their starter, Connor Basilick's out, and they already said they're going to split reps between Brady Cook and Tyler Macon, which is just horrible for DFS. 11-point total against a rough defense, like the best defense in the country. You can't play Missouri. And Tyler Beatty, this probably affects his efficiency. He's still expensive on both platforms. Really efficient. He's the second leading target getter, averages about 125 rushing yards, but Beatty's just in such a tough matchup that what's the upside here for a team projected to score 11 points? They run a wide receiver rotation. You're just not playing anyone on Missouri. For Georgia, they run rotations at every position, which is really problematic. Missouri is the worst run defense in the country, or at least they're up there. They're allowing 280 rushing yards per game. So Zamir White, James Cook, they should see enough efficiency to maybe consider for tournaments. James Cook in particular, who's cheaper, but these players are not going to receive their normal workloads because Georgia should be winning this game by nearly 40 points. So maybe you could get to a Kenny McIntosh. Maybe you could get to a Daewan Edwards, who hasn't carried the ball in the last two games. But these two players should see elevated workloads. Kendall Milton is out. So these backups will have some carries here. It's just a complete dart throw because you're going to see four players rotate in. In the receiving game, the only player with a condensed opportunity is Adonai Mitchell. Brock Bowers has started rotating with John Fitzpatrick and Darnell Washington. Ladd McConkey has started working in with like Jermaine Burton, Kyrus Jackson, Marcus Rosemy, Jack Saint. All these players are returning from injury, and it's just made a nasty rotation. So predicting who gets the work in a game that likely features mostly running plays, I don't think we can play Georgia. And that stems to the quarterback situation. JT Daniels is healthy. Stetson Bennett has played so well that they can't bench him right now. But how many attempts do we see from Bennett? He's only averaging 15 per game. He's been really efficient, but is there a ceiling outside of just pure efficiency? There is, but because of the rotation, it's really tough to peg who's going to get it, which makes Georgia a team I'm also likely avoiding outside of just massive tournaments. Tough, but it's true. Ohio State taking on Nebraska, 65-point total, which is very good here. Ohio State, 14.5-point favorites, 15 in some spot. Ohio State's not very fast in terms of their offensive play volume, but they're above average in pass rate, and they haven't needed to play fast because they've done it with efficiency. Now, CJ Stroud has been phenomenal, averaging nearly 325 passing yards per game. Not the most mobile, but his ceiling is still very clear through the air. Now, he has very clear target distribution as well. We have Garrett Wilson, we have Chris Olave, and Jackson Smith-Njigba has been a player who's played an increased role lately. He's actually worked ahead of Olave in terms of just overall targets per game recently. He's at least been close. It's 7 for Olave, 6.3 for Smith-Njigba, but their receiving yardage is not close. They're using Smith-Njigba more downfield. He's averaging 81 yards per game to Olave 70.3. So Olave's kind of in this no man's pricing tier where he's only 200 cheaper than Wilson, the clear target leader, and he's about 1,000 more expensive than Jackson Smith-Njigba, who has close to the same workload as him. So I would rather just get down and save the money. On FanDuel, this difference is even more prominent where Olave is still the most expensive receiver, and he's just not being used in the same role as last year. Jeremy Ruckert is their tight end. He's averaging 4 targets per game over their last 4, but he's going to need touchdowns, just low upside there. Master Teague is still banged up in the run game, but it doesn't matter whether he plays or not. We've seen the full Trevion Henderson show at this point, and he is not giving back this job. He's averaging over 100 rushing yards on just 14.5 attempts per game. Look at the receiving work. He's averaging over 20 yards, and again, just 14.5 attempts per game. Since he's gotten healthy, we've now seen him in an immense role, and last week, he comes out, carries the ball 28 times, 2 targets in the pass game. Maybe he doesn't see 30 touches again, but he has immense upside against Nebraska here. On the other side, tougher matchup for the Cornhuskers. Adrian Martinez has been good, very good dual threat, 438 yards, decent as a passer, 250 on just 27 attempts. That's pretty efficient, but it's a tough matchup for him here. What is the upside for a player on a 2-touchdown underdog Nebraska team? I think it's tough to play him, but he's viable in GPPs. The run game is tough to get to. Ramir Johnson splits time with Jaquez Yant, and Martinez is so active in the run game that they kind of all just cannibalize each other. In the receiving game, The number one receiver is Samori Toure, and it's not even really close. He's averaging 63 yards per game on 5.8 targets. The rest of the receivers have been extremely volatile. 1 week it's Omar Manning. 1 week it's Tyden Austin Allen. Another week it's Levi Falk. And Samori Toure is cheap enough where I don't think you need to play the roulette with the ancillary guys. You can just play him if you're playing one at all. Wake Forest taking on North Carolina, the single best game environment on the slate. It is a 77-point total in some spots. We have it at 76.5. The spread is 2.5 points in favor of UNC, which is funny because Wake Forest is the undefeated team, but obviously a phenomenal game environment for both sides. Sam Hartman is exceedingly expensive, $10K on DraftKings, averaging over 300 yards per game and mobile on the ground with 200 rushing yards cumulatively, but just an exorbitant price tag for him. There are better options. If you can find the salary to save, there are easy ways to stack Hartman. Jackery Roberson and A.T. Perry are the two alphas. They average 9.8 and 8 targets per game, respectively, both well over 700 yards. Those are the two options you get to. Taylor Morin has played a little bit less recently. He's still splitting time with Donald Stewart and Keyshawn Williams to a degree. I would rather just pay up rather than take the dart throws, but the game environment is so good that maybe in your double stacks, you take shots on Morin, Stewart, and Williams. Morin is still running the most routes. Even though he hasn't been targeted as much, he would be the player I prefer. In the run game, a direct three-way timeshare between Beal Smith, Turner, and Ellison. Beal Smith has the best workload, but even he still averages only 12.9 touches per game. North Carolina does allow about 176 rushing yards per game, but the roulette you have to play with these Wake backs is just a lot. And I don't think I will be ending up playing any of them outside of big tournaments. On the North Carolina side, Sam Howell has overcome the departure of basically all his important skill position players and played extremely well. He's taken his rushing to a new level. He has 4 games over 100 yards rushing, just absolute absurd volume there. 595 cumulative yards. So Howell has been a fantastic dual threat quarterback. And then passing, he has 5 games over 300 yards. He's only averaging 274, but the upside is clear. Wake Forest defense has been poor, particularly on the ground. So luckily Howell's dual threat ability takes advantage of that. Howell is a better play straight up than Hartman. In the run game, it's a 1-2 punch with Ty Chandler leading the way, DJ Jones being a change of pace. Ty Chandler's been very efficient. He just doesn't have the same bell cow workload as some of the other backs on the slate. But at 6,600, he's not priced up. You can certainly get to him because of the game environment. And he's also a decent pass catcher. So Ty Chandler, somebody that I have interest in. In the receiving game, Josh Downs is the purest of alphas in the country. 42% target share, averaging 122 yards per game, averaging 13.8 targets over their last 4 games. If you can, you stack Downs, and there are ways to do so. Emory Simmons transferred. Antoine Green is kind of this middling price receiver who jumped up for 7 targets last week, but that is definitely an anomaly. He only averages 3.1 per game, and his role didn't really change. He's been on the field most of the time this year. So you could maybe get to him. But outside of that, we had Justin Olsen run a route on 100% of dropbacks. He has 2 targets in each of the last 2 games, so not targeted much, but he's on the field every single play. Could he backdoor his way into a couple more catches or even a score against Wake Forest? Certainly, and he's the stone minimum on DraftKings. So Olsen might be your path to more studs, maybe a stars and scrubs approach. Next game, we have Liberty taking on Ole Miss, a 9.5-point spread in favor of Ole Miss, a 66.5-point total. Malik Willis is another quarterback that I would rather play over Hartman, but it's a tough matchup for him. Ole Miss hasn't been good on defense, but a big step up in competition for Liberty, who's typically playing G5 teams. Willis is fantastic. One of the best dual threats in the country. He already has 684 yards, averages 220 as a passer. I would expect some regression in efficiency, but Willis is still a fantastic play. There is upside here based on his rushing. He's easier to stack than we've seen in previous weeks. Don't make anything of the starters here. They don't start their main receivers like Kevin Shaw starts, but Demario Douglas, CJ Daniels, and Noah Firth are the guys you want to look at. Douglas and Daniels are a little expensive for me. They're only averaging 4.7 and 5 targets respectively, but Noah Firth is playing most of the snaps. He's averaging 4.3 targets and he's 3.8K. So he's my preferred run back if you're playing Ole Miss stacks or just looking at Liberty players. We do not know the status of Joshua Mack yet. He missed their last game, but there's been no update on his status. They rotate 3 or 4 backs anyway, so I'm not playing Liberty running backs. And Malik Willis is so active there that it hurts the team. Matt Corral is questionable again. We've seen this for the last couple weeks. He always plays through it. So expecting Corral to get out there. 519 rushing yards, averaging 276 through the air on 31.5 attempts. Corral is a good play. I am worried about his pass catchers. There are injuries now to their top 3 receivers. Mingo is out. Dontario Drummond left last week's game, did not return. Outside of just like a weird reverse play where they suggested that there was no chance he got hurt, but it's a hamstring, which is concerning. Braylon Sanders warmed up for the game, but then he allegedly couldn't cut in one direction, so he sat out. I'd say Sanders is more likely to play than Drummond, but there's a decent chance we see both sit. Now, if both play, they're the 1 and the 2. If one of them plays, they easily become the alpha. But the players that are going to step up, Ja'Cour Pearson saw 9 targets in their place. He would be the next most active receiver. Behind him, they split snaps almost down the middle between John Rice Plumlee, Jaden Jackson, and Danish Jackson. I would rather play Plumlee. He's active in the run game, and he's 3,200. He ran the most routes as well. So Plumlee, if both Drummond and Sanders sit. In the run game, it's back to being a 3-way timeshare. Jerry and Ely's lost his role after the concussion. Henry Parish and Snoop Connor have just played so well that they haven't needed Ely a ton, but he will still be a factor, making this a very tough backfield to get to. Parish is more your banger back, and Connor's more your banger back, and Parish is more your pass catcher. So there is a somewhat differentiated role here, but neither back a strong play. You're going to need to hit the lotto guessing which one gets the touchdowns or the most work on the pass game. It's a tough situation to get to outside of tournaments. SMU Memphis, another phenomenal game environment here, 71-point total, 4.5-point spread in favor of the Mustangs. Both teams are running with pace. Both teams are passing the ball at an extreme rate. So this is a phenomenal game environment. On the SMU side, Tanner Mordecai is one of these quarterbacks we should be looking at for sure, averaging nearly 330 passing yards per game on 37.5 attempts. And he is mobile. He has 176 rushing yards on the year, which is solid. Not as good as some of the other guys we mentioned, but very, very good overall. And he's easy to stack. They use 3 receivers and 1 tight end almost every single play. It's Danny Gray, it's Rashee Rice, it's Reggie Roberson at receiver, and then it's Grant Calcaterra at tight end. Gray is the receiving leader in terms of yards and targets on the year. He's an absolutely amazing play. Rashee Rice has been targeted more than Gray in their last 4 games, 9.3 to 8. But you're splitting hairs here. I think both are certainly viable. Roberson is kind of the odd man out here. He's not running as many routes. He's not seeing as many targets. Again, he had 2 season-ending injuries in back-to-back years, so he's just taking a step back. You still can play him in tournaments. Grant Calcaterra is the cheapest option here, and he's averaging 6.5 targets per game over the last 4. That's a full target more than Roberson. So Calcaterra is somebody that is worth getting to at 4K flat. He should be popping in a lot of projections. On the other side, Seth Hennigan is hurt. He's questionable for this game. This is a big injury piece to monitor here. So Seth Hennigan overall, he's averaging over 300 passing yards per game. Not very mobile, but it doesn't matter. There's just so much volume here for this Memphis team. His absence would be huge, though. Peter Parish is a completely different quarterback. We saw him really struggle in his first start. His best asset is his legs. So you could play him, but I think it does affect the pass catchers. Again, this guy threw the ball 48 times in his first start and only managed 250 yards. Also 0 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. But Calvin Austin's still at 11 targets. It is a downgrade, but Austin is still extremely active. He's going to get carries. You can play him at an elevated price. You're just hoping Hennigan's out there. Behind him, Sean Dykes and Javon Ivory, the tight end Dykes, that is. They're the next 2 targets on the team. Ivory's been the second most active of late, but still only 4.8 targets for him. He's splitting time more with Eddie Lewis and even another player up in Gabriel Rogers, who's listed as a running back, but he returned from injury. He's actually playing slot receiver. Excuse me, there, I had to locate him because he's labeled with the running back tag. But Gabriel Rogers is a receiver. He saw 5 targets in their last game. I'm expecting Lewis, Rogers, and Ivory to rotate a little bit. So Dykes would be the second option for me. He's the second leading receiver if I'm not playing Austin. In the run game, Brandon Thomas was a victim of game script. He also will be cannibalized by like Rodriguez Clark, who missed the game. He may return here. Awesemo and Kylan Watkins, they all play a little bit. And then if Parish is active, it definitely hurts Thomas. So he's not a preferred play for me as an underdog here. Navy taking on Notre Dame, a 21-point spread in favor of the Irish. 48-point total overall is very low. Navy is the same story. Do you play anybody? The answer is typically no. Their quarterback needs to be treated as a mid-price running back because of the no-volume passing attack. But Ty Lavatai, he's been seeing the volume. Navy's offense uses the quarterback as the engine of the offense. but this is a guy that still only has 242 rushing yards on the year. So just not enough output here. Notre Dame's going to key on him, obviously. Ruos and James Harris split fullback. Chance Warren and Carlinos AC are the slot backs. More involvement for Warren of late. He had 10 carries and 2 targets in the last game, but none of this is enough to play against Notre Dame. Ignore Navy. On the other side, Jack Cohn is still splitting time with Tyler Buckner at quarterback. Buckner playing those run Gajewski type plays. Think of him like a fancy Taysom Hill. Cohn has no mobility, and now his volume has been steadily decreasing since he opened the year as the lone quarterback, but just the timeshare makes him impossible to target. In the run game, Kyron Williams has been an absolute bell cow back of late. He has over 20 touches in 3 straight games. Part of that because Chris Tyree's been banged up, but even in their last game, they used Logan Diggs more as a change of pace, and Kyron Williams still touched the ball 24 times. So at 7,700, he's still in play. I would not say he's a preferred option up there because of the spread, because Navy is going to slow the pace, but you could get to him. In the receiving room, Michael Mayer still leads the team in targets and receiving yards. Everything with Notre Dame's pass catchers suggests like you should be concerned with volume today, or tomorrow, I should say. We're recording this on Friday. Navy is going to slow the pace. They're going to be down in this game. How many targets does Mayer actually see? And I think this stems all the way down to Austin and Avery Davis and Braden Lenzy as well. So they're not playing any Notre Dame pass catchers, but if I was, it would be Michael Mayer at 5,800. Illinois taking on Minnesota, a game to forget for the most part. It is a 44-point total. Illinois is implied for just 14.75 points. Both teams slow, both teams run heavy, more so on the Minnesota side. But Illinois started Brandon Peters last week. You just can't play him. He's averaging 86 yards a game, negative rushing yards. Chase Brown, he's worked ahead of Josh McCray, but they still have frustratingly used them in a timeshare. Chase Brown is a top 10 back in terms of expected points added and efficiency, which is saying a lot playing for this Illinois team, but their coaching staff just cannot figure out their play calling, and they cannot evaluate their player personnel. So they still have yet to give him the workload. He's a GPP play potentially worth targeting against the stout Minnesota run defense. He still has seen a lot of chances in certain games. In the receiving game, Isaiah Williams is the target leader, but he only has 1 game above 5 targets in their last 4. You're not really playing any Illinois pass catchers. If you're feeling fancy, Casey Washington, Donnie Navarro, the wide receiver 2 and 3. Daniel Barker's the tight end, splitting time with Luke Ford. Don't play Illinois. On Minnesota, Tanner Morgan is a low-volume passer and non-mobile rusher. Not the best quarterback in terms of efficiency either. He's averaging 18 attempts per game. You can't play him. That stems down to the receivers. Ottman Bell's too expensive for a guy averaging 5.8 targets per game, propped up by a 12-target game. Dylan Wright and Mike Stevens-Brown are the wide receiver 2 and 3. That has put Daniel Jackson and Mike Brown-Stevens are the wide receiver 2 and 3, which has put Dylan Wright on the back burner, none of whom are targets at all. Jackson would be the best play. In the run game, we now have had serious injuries to Muhammad Ibrahim, Trey Potts, and last week, Bryce Williams. Bryce Williams went down and he's not going to play here. They used freshman Marquise Irving in a 50-50 timeshare with Kai Thomas. They both went over 100 rushing yards, and they both saw a couple targets. I don't think there's a clear delineation between the two, and DraftKings priced them both up. If I were playing one, it'd probably be Kai Thomas at 5K, but I think there's better cheap options on this slate. But they're both in play. We know Minnesota runs the ball at the highest rate in the country, one of them at least, and they should have some efficiency and success against Illinois as 14.5-point favorites. So those are the only 2 options for Minnesota, Marquise Irving and Kai Thompson, really the only 2 in the game. Tulsa taking on Cincinnati. We have a 22.5-point spread, a 55-point total. Tulsa not really implied for any points. Again, they're also below 17. They're fast. They're pass heavy, but Davis Brin is turnover prone. He's not mobile. He's averaging 260 yards per game, and he's now going up against perhaps the best pass defense he's faced all year. Brin is not an option. Maybe you could play some of his pass catchers because they're cheap. Keelan Stokes is listed on DraftKings as out. He's not out yet. The hopes have been that he would return for this game, so watch his status. But either way, I don't think you're playing any Tulsa pass catchers. They run 4 wide most of the time. Josh Johnson's too expensive, even though he's the target leader. Juan Carlos Santana has taken a backseat to Sam Crawford in recent weeks, 4.8 targets for Santana to 5.8 for Crawford. And Stokes is the wild card. Ezra Naylor has played nearly every snap without Stokes, but they could be in a timeshare. Stokes could come back and play all the snaps. We just don't know. You're not playing a running back against Cincinnati, Shamari Brooks, Deneric Prince. They just don't have enough projected efficiency or volume here to get it done in a tough matchup. On the Cincinnati side, They're extremely slow, but they're balanced in pass rate. And this might change after the slap in the face from the College Football Playoff Committee. But we won't get into my opinions on the matter. But Cincinnati needs to beat teams by more than they have. They need to show some more urgency. So Ritter has been a victim of the slow pace, and Cincinnati essentially taking their foot off the gas all year. He only has 171 rushing yards, which is really bad for him. He's got strong mobility. They just haven't used him that way. And he's only averaging 230 passing yards despite being efficient, only 28 attempts per game. Again, just not using him enough. Maybe this slap in the face is what they need to put their foot on the gas and have Ritter reach a ceiling. But so far, he's just a fancy game manager propped up by a good team total. I think he's viable in GPPs. The receivers have the same problems as Ritter, so I won't stick with this too long. But the top two pass catchers are Pierce and Michael Young. Pierce is way too expensive for a guy averaging 5.6 targets, unless you think Cincinnati takes a different approach this week. Michael Young is viable. He's averaging 3.8 targets per game, and he's 3,600, a good attachment, the wide receiver 2 to Ritter. Outside of that, Leonard Taylor would be who I prefer. He's splitting time with Josh Wiley, but he's just playing a little bit more, and he's nearly $2K cheaper. In the run game, Jerome Ford has the same problems as Ritter, except he has been extremely efficient. So Ford has been able to overcome some of the volume issues. But for reference, Ford is averaging 18.5 touches per game. Some of the other backs in the country, like Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson, those guys are almost getting 10 more touches per game than Ford. And Ford's efficiency, over 100 yards per game, decent pass catcher. That suggests he should be better than he is. But again, Ford has been getting there with efficiency, and now we could see extra volume to back it up. So Ford is certainly in play against Tulsa's defense, allowing 173 yards per game. Michigan State taking on Purdue with 52-point total. The Spartans only 2.5, 3-point favorites in some spots. Not the best game environment, but Michigan State's playing a little slower than normal. We have seen their play volume spike in certain competitive matchups. Michigan game stands out. They're balanced in terms of pass to run rate. They're very sensitive to game script. So when they get up, they will pound the run. Peyton Thorne's been really efficient, somewhat mobile, 96 yards on the ground, 235 passing yards per game on just 26 and a half attempts. But Thorne has shown great efficiency here. The issue is we saw Jalen Naylor get hurt, and he had a cast on his hand. Rumors coming out of East Lansing are saying he broke some fingers, and the beat reporters seem to think he's going to miss the game. But Michigan State is one of the quietest teams in injuries. You won't know till he suits up pregame, if he's active or not. But I would think he's not going to play, which puts Jaden Reed into a huge workload. He already saw 11 targets last week. He is the leader in terms of yards, 642 for him, 80 per game. Reed is somebody to look at. And if Naylor misses time, Trey Mosley should come into a bigger role. Trey Mosley was still the wide receiver 3 last week, even though he didn't see a target. And then the guy that would replace Naylor is Montori Foster, who had 3 targets immediately. He's basically a completely unknown, but he's the min price. Maybe he's a pivot off the cheap UNC receiver who's min price. I think there are min price options here. In the run game, Kenneth Walker is just a stone beast. He's averaged over 20 touches per game easily in the last 4. He's averaging 23 per game on the year, 149 rushing yards per game. The one positive thing I'll say about Walker that we hadn't seen all year that we saw against Michigan, his target volume went up. He had 3 targets coming out of the backfield, and he played well. So in negative game script, we can have more confidence that Walker will be on the field, which I now feel pretty comfortable about. He's an excellent play against Purdue. On the other side, Aidan O'Connell is one of the worst quarterbacks in terms of mobility in the country, and he has to get a 300-yard bonus to overcome this. Fortunately, he has repeatedly, because Purdue is an anomalous team in the Big Ten West. They're very they're very pass heavy. They're the pass heaviest team in the Big Ten West, and they're extremely up-tempo. So they have a ton of play volume, which has helped him get over 300 yards a bunch of times. He's been at least 370 in back-to-back games against Minnesota and Iowa earlier this year. Michigan State allows over 300 passing yards per game. When you break it down to a per attempt basis, they're much better than that, but volume's gotten O'Connell there. Rather than play him, I think I might rather just play a pass catcher, but O'Connell's cheap. You can certainly get to him in stacks. The guy you want to stack him with is David Bell. He's averaging 11.5 targets per game over the last 4. Easily one of the best receivers in the country. They saw Payne Durham go down, their tight end, which means maybe Milton Wright and Jackson Anthrop receive more opportunities. They're wide receiver 2 and 3, which is what happened in their most recent game. Wright is averaging 5.5 targets per game to Anthrop's 3.8. And the problem with Anthrop is he'll split time with TJ Sheffield and Brock Thompson at receiver. The tight end that will play in place of Payne Durham is Paul Pifferi, who's the stone min, only had 1 target in the last game and only has 4 total targets on the year. But Peferi came in and he was really the only other tight end that saw work. So complete unknown, but maybe someone worth mentioning. Xander Horvath came back in the run game, 11 carries to King Doru, 17. This should be like a 50-50 timeshare. Not efficient enough, and they don't have enough pass game work to really target here. I think they're just pure GPP plays now with the timeshare projected. Oklahoma State taking on West Virginia. Oklahoma State is a 3.5-point favorite, a 49-point total, which leaves a lot to be desired. But Oklahoma State plays really fast. They're also very run heavy. West Virginia has struggled with efficiency, which has depressed their play volume, but they've been fast in spots when they can. 55% pass rate for the Mountaineers. Spencer Sanders is a game manager basically through and through. He has nearly 300 yards on the ground, but only 192 through the air. We have seen upside from him in random spots, and he has one 300-yard game this year, came against Kansas State, but he only has one other game above 200 yards. So most of the time, those 300-yard games are few and far between. Sanders is just a GPP play. In the run game, they played Kansas last week, so don't really take anything away from this weird distribution of carries where like Jaden Nixon popped up for 11, like Zach Middleton had 4. It's still the Jalen Warren show. And prior to that, he had at least 18 attempts in 3 straight games. He was over 30 attempts in 2 of the 3. I think you could still get to Warren, and now his price has fallen. He averages 24 opportunities per game, over 100 rushing yards, very active as a pass catcher. He has a 17 targets on the year there. Very comfortable with Warren at his price. In the receiving game, Tay Martin is still the alpha, but we saw the return of Bryson Green, and he immediately put Rashad Owens on the bench. Owens had pushed Presley a little bit in recent weeks, so it was interesting to see them just go flat out. Bryson Green starts, plays ahead of Owens, but that's now your 3 wide receiver set. It's Tay Martin, it's Brennan Presley, and it is Bryson Green, who's really cheap at 4K. I think all are viable in stacks, but again, those should be contrarian. On the other side, Deggy's your QB, not mobile whatsoever, splitting time with Garrett Green, and it's very similar to the Notre Dame situation. Like Buckner comes in as that dynamic rusher. That's what Garrett Green is doing. He has 300 yards on the ground, not going to get pass volume, but Deggy's going to be your pure pocket passer. So very similar to Notre Dame. Neither are strong plays. In the run game, Letty Brown still has elite workload. He struggled with efficiency behind West Virginia's poor offensive line, and they run into a buzzsaw of an Oklahoma State run defense, allowing 94 yards per game. But Letty Brown's opportunities are there. He's, again, a contrarian player based on volume, and he's very, very much targeted coming out of the backfield, 32 targets per game. That's 4.8 targets per game over their last 4, so he gives you a good floor there. Outside of that, Winston Wright and Bryce Ford Wheaton are the 2 clear receivers to target. Winston Wright has been a little better than Ford Wheaton. He's averaging 7.8 targets per game over the last 4 to 5.5 for Wheaton. So that's my preference, with there being a slight price difference. And Winston Wright's actually cheaper on FanDuel. Outside of that, Sam James rotates with Isaiah Esdell and Sean Ryan. Esdell had the 8-target game in the last contest, but his routes were actually below Sam James and Sean Ryan. So tough to get to any of them. Michael O'Loughlin is out at tight end. So maybe you see more TJ Banks or some other tight end. I don't know. West Virginia, they've kind of been a mess this year. Moving to Auburn, Texas A&M, a 49 total here as well. So another game that leaves a lot to be desired. A&M is a 4.5-point, 5-point favorite in some spots. Auburn obviously is the new coach. They've been way faster in terms of pace and pass heavier as well, 52% pass rate. Nix has somewhat improved his efficiency, 179 rushing yards, but still just 220 pass yards per game for Nix. He leaves a lot to be desired. The running backfield, Tank Bigsby is splitting time with Jarquez Hunter. Hard to believe, but these 2 backs are 2 of the most efficient in the country. So Jarquez has been so good that you just can't take him off the field. That should be like a 60-40 split, a 70-30 split for the foreseeable future. And you also run the issue of Sean Shivers coming out and siphoning pass game work. He has at least 4 targets in 3 of the last 4 games. So it is essentially a 3-way timeshare, with Shivers being the pass-catching back. The receivers basically have the same target share across the board. They all have a 16% target share, and Demetrius Robertson, Kobe Hudson, and Shedrick Jackson. Only 1 target separates them. Again, Kobe Hudson is the most yards, narrowly just 10 yards ahead of Robertson, and Jackson has been used more underneath, but very little separating these players. Robertson has the most targets per game over their last 4. And then John Samuel Schenker, their tight end, he's on the field for just as many snaps, just a more low volume role, but he's only 3,300. Texas A&M plays great defense. I don't think you want to play any of them outside of contrarian Nick stacks. On the other side, Calzada's been just basically terrible. He's some of the worst efficiency among Power 5 quarterbacks. You're not playing him outside of just contrarian stacks, but I wouldn't recommend it. If you do, he's fairly easy to stack. Anais Smith and Jalen Weidermeyer are the 1 and 2, but they've suffered from efficiency issues and target volume issues behind Zach Calzada. And outside of them, it's really hard to get to this offense because you've seen the return of some of the receivers like Caleb Chapman, Jalen Preston, Damon Demas, Chase Lane. They're all healthy and they're all rotating behind Smith and Weidermeyer. Tough situation to get to. In the run game, Isaiah Spiller and Devin Achane are seeing basically a 50-50 timeshare at this point. And Achane's been more efficient than Spiller on fewer carries. So they cannot stop doing this. They should keep Achane on the field. And for the first time in our projections behind the glass, we'll give you a little note here. Achane projects for more rushing yards than Spiller. It is extremely close, and it is on fewer opportunities. That's how good Achane has been. But these two guys, tougher matchup against Auburn's defense. It's definitely not a cakewalk. In a 50-50 timeshare, I think they're both just pure GPP plays. And there are other options that are better at cheaper price points like Jalen Warren. Baylor taking on TCU. This TCU team just fired their coach. Both teams extremely run heavy, extremely slow. It's a 7-point spread in favor of Baylor, 58 total overall. Jerry Bohannon's a pure game manager. So you can't get to him assuming the spread is where this game lands, where the spread is. Bohannon needs negative game script to hit his ceiling. He's somewhat mobile, efficient as a passer, but just no volume. Taekwon Thornton is the alpha receiver. He does average 8.8 targets per game over their last 4, which is positive. It's a 30% target share. But again, what are you going to play, a one-off of Taekwon Thornton? I guess you could against TCU's bad defense, but it still seems risky. RJ Sneed and Drew Estrada round out the receiving core. Both are averaging about 5 targets per game, a little north of that. Ben Sims is the tight end. He averages 3.5 targets per game, just GPP plays. Abram Smith has worked ahead of Tristan Ebner in recent weeks. Rather than the 50-50 timeshare it was to begin the year, it is now a 60-40, a 70-30, but in favor of Abram Smith. And both guys are active in the pass game, which I think is positive. And perhaps against TCU, if the Horned Frogs keep this close, you see Abram Smith handle even more work. It was just 2 weeks ago, we saw Smith outcarry Ebner 27-10. Last week, it was 21-12. But this could ebb and flow a little bit here. Smith, I expect to continue leading the backfield. TCU allows 225 rush yards per game, so both are in play. Ebner, even as a punt play, 4,100. If you think Baylor gets up by maybe more than a touchdown in the game, he should see 10 to 15 touches. Dugan, what to make of Dugan? They fired their coach. They've tried to increase their run rate more. Dugan is active in the run game for TCU, 250 yards on the ground. And he has been efficient. Just they haven't been able to stop opponents and stay in games. And then they fail to press the pace. Their pass rate's still really low. Dugan still doesn't have a ceiling based on his volume. He's a GPP target. If you stack him, it's with Quentin Johnston, averaging 8.7 targets per game over their last 3. Easily the alpha leader in terms of targets. And from there, we saw their receiver distribution narrow a little bit. Darius Davis and Tay Barber worked way ahead of the other normal cast of crew. Savion Williams, Quincy Brown, Blair Conwright, J.D. Spielman retired. You might see this return to a rotation at any point in time, so I'm worried about Tay Barber and Darius Davis, but Tay Barber would be your cheap stacking option with Dugan right now for cheapies, and Quentin Johnston's just your clear alpha who's a little underpriced here. In the run game, Zach Evans is questionable. He had a walking boot on his foot in their last game, but he was labeled a game-time decision, so a little bit confusing to me. Usually guys in walking boots aren't game-time decisions, but Evans is purely questionable. If he's out there, he's going to be their clear leader and a great play. If he's not, Kendre Miller should lead a backfield that also uses DeMarco Foster and Amari DeMercado. I'm still comfortable with Kendre Miller, but just in pure GPPs, whereas Evans at his price, he projects pretty well based on his role. He's been extremely efficient, averaging over 100 yards per game. You just worry about the injury, which is why he would not become like a cash game play for me. And final game, we have Penn State taking on Maryland, a 10-point spread in favor of the Nittany Lions. 55.5 point total, which is very good overall. One I like the over in. Both teams are fast. Both teams are extremely pass heavy. So this lends itself to DFS. And Clifford's gotten a price reduction after a couple bad games. Remember, this guy got forced from the Iowa injury with a separated shoulder and then returned as quickly as possible and has since recovered a little bit. He's played better in recent weeks. So Clifford averaging 251 yards per game, somewhat mobile with 133 yards. I still like getting to him. Easy to stack. Jahan Dotson's too cheap for his role, averaging 14.3 targets per game in their last 4. They're cheap as well with Parker Washington as the wide receiver 2. Keandre Lambert-Smith is the wide receiver 3. He's only 3,800. Both are strong plays here. Probably not getting to Brenton Strange or Theo Johnson as the tight ends. I would rather stick to the cheap receivers or just get up to Dotson. In the run game, Baylor transfer John Lovett has worked ahead of Noah Kane and Kevon Lee. Devin Ford is still banged up here. And you could see elevated opportunity for Lovett moving forward. He's had tough matchups down the stretch, and this Maryland team allows 170 yards per game. Lovett's only 3,300, so with the team implied for over 30 points, nearly 33, I'm comfortable taking a stab on him at 3,300. On the Maryland side, Taulia Tagovailoa is benefiting from overall just pure volume. No rushing upside for him. His efficiency's been good, over 8 yards per attempt, completing 70% of his passes, and he backdoors his way into 300 yards a lot. This is a tough matchup for him, but volume will be there. And it's still there even with Demas and Jayshon Jones out for the year. Raheem Jarrett still the wide receiver 1, seeing healthy target volume, just hasn't broken a big game yet. Not sure if it'll come, but he's cheap enough to play. And then the wide receiver 2 and 3 became Marcus Fleming and Carlos Carrier. Carrier had the massive game, but he ran less routes than Fleming. I'm still going to just play Demas. Excuse me, I'm going to play Jarrett over Carrier. Carrier, who's somehow more expensive than Jarrett. And I would rather play Fleming at a cheaper price. In the run game, direct 50-50 timeshare between Taekwon Fleet-Javis and Shalin Famatu. We saw Isaiah Jacobs. He's transferring, and then Penny Boone's not on the depth chart. So it should be a direct 50-50 split between the two. Probably not getting to them in more negative game script. They played Indiana last week, so they could really just run the ball. But Penn State is a different animal. But that'll do it for our main slate. Thank you guys for watching. Let me know in the comment section who your favorite play is. Also, hit the thumbs up button on the way out. I am Matt Gajewski on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. Thank you guys for watching.